Brilliant. So welcome to Bridging the Corporate Ambition Gap. I'm Devina, Policy and Program Manager at carbongap. carbongap advocates for the responsible scale-up of carbon removal methods focused on eliminating the carbon dioxide that's already heating up the planet. This webinar comes at a critical moment in history where nation states gather once again at COP27. We know that government action is only one piece of the puzzle, and thankfully, businesses are rising up to this decade-defining challenge. We hope that this webinar can be a space for debate as to how companies can be pioneers of high-impact climate ambition. I'll now pass on to Eli, Chief Science and Advocacy Officer and co-founder at carbongap, to moderate the session.
Thank you, Devina. And as you can see, I'm coming to you live from Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where COP27 is in full swing. So we wanted to say briefly that for those who are interested in what's happening at COP27 related to carbon removal specifically, carbongap, we co-founded a web platform and an initiative with the UNFCCC High-Level Champions team and other partners that collates all the carbon removals content at COP in one place, including this event today. So please visit carbonremovals.org to check out the CDR at COP initiative. So we've got a lot in store for you today. First, we'll hear from my co-author on the report, Robert Höglund, who will summarize some of the key findings and provide some provocative ideas to kick off the debate. Second, excuse me, we're really thrilled to have a representative from the UK's Climate Change Committee, Senior Analyst Bea Natzler, who led the CCC's recent report on voluntary carbon markets, and will share with us her perspective on the dynamic between voluntary carbon markets and climate action that's motivated by government intervention. Following Bea's remarks, we will switch over to a panel discussion with four quite esteemed climate thinkers and practitioners. We're really privileged to have them with us today, and they'll join for a moderated discussion. So without further ado, over to Robert, then Bea, and then you'll see me again after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Eli. Good to see so many joining. We're going to present this report that we've been actually talking about and working on for quite a long time. So it's great to be able to show it to all of you. And bridging the ambition gap, looking at how companies can help finance carbon removal with other climate solutions. As we know, CDR, carbon dioxide removal, is part of the solution we needed to stabilize temperatures alongside dramatic emission reductions. And to do that from a very small scale, where carbon removal is today, especially durable carbon removal, is going to be a gigantic challenge, going from tens of thousands of tons to billions of tons just in a span of a couple of decades. So it's extraordinarily difficult. Governments are going to have to do a lot of this, but corporate support can be very catalytic here, and we already seen some of this happening. We have Zeke Hausfather here from Frontier, for example, where Stripe and Shopify has really been kickstarting the early carbon removal market. But there's not that many companies doing that so far. Klarna is also on the panel, one of the companies giving early support, but we need a lot more for this to be to reaching the sort of potential it can have and reach the type of sums that are necessary. This is focused on carbon removal, but of course, when we're talking about corporate support to climate, it also includes other types of solutions like supporting NGOs or supporting nature restoration or advocacy and policy projects, etc. And what we're looking at in the report is the ambition gap between companies' ability to pay for external climate solutions like carbon removal on the one hand, and on the other hand, their willingness to pay. And there's a lot of differences between different companies, and the ability to pay is radically different between different types of companies. One thing that goes into it is the profit per ton emitted. And that's a calculation where you take total profits and divide it by the emissions that the company has, either just looking at their scope 1 and 2 emissions and getting a profit per ton for scope 1 and 2, or taking it for the entire value chain and having scope 1 to 3 and getting this profit per ton. Then companies also have internal investment needs to reduce their own emissions. And this is also systematically different between different groups of companies. So the ones that have the biggest profits per ton might be the ones that have the lowest abilities to actually finance internal emission reductions as well. So we'll look a little bit more at. And this is one of the graphs in the paper, spelling this out, showing that the ability to pay is in part driven by the profit per ton. Everything, the company could, of course, not spend all its profits on climate, in the long run at least, because of those other necessary things that are shareholders are demanding, that legal obligations like taxes, etc. And then on the other hand, we have the willingness to pay. How big part of a profit will companies be incentivized to spend on climate? And this is influenced by several factors, such as the internal culture, what others are doing, what are the company's peers doing, how much recognition do companies think that they will get if they do something like this, is things that could raise the willingness to pay. And then there's even higher theoretical headroom for climate action if sort of the gray part over here can be reduced, where laws and policies are changed to, for example, less demand for delivering profits to shareholders or things like that. That could theoretically widen the ability to pay even more. And in this paper, we created a small data set of companies on the Forbes 2000 list, where we looked at which companies do have emissions published. We took a look at the top 250 companies on the Forbes 2000 list for 2021, that is 2020 data for 2020. And we could find scope 1 to 2 emissions for about 179 companies, and a little bit less for scope 3 emissions. And then in the Forbes data, we have data on revenue and profits. So we did this kind of mapping, looking at profits per ton on the one hand, and then total emissions on the other hand. And here we can see this is a double log scale on both sides. But on the left side, we see the profit per ton. How many dollars does these companies make per ton that they emit in scope 1 and 2? And on the bottom axis, we see total scope 1 and 2 emissions. And here something stands really clear, and that is that the low emitters are capturing most of the profit. So around 15% of emissions come from this big group here, but they also capture 85% of profits. And then the small group here that has 85% of emissions, they also commercially then have only 15% of profits. So this also illustrates the limitations of the polluter pays principle when it's about financing external climate solutions, because the ones that have the largest emissions are the ones that can pay the least, and inversely so. And what we can see then, that the companies that can generate the most money for climate are the ones with the lowest emissions, and both on an absolute and a relative scale. And here we also included scope 3. So looking at profit per ton for all scopes, and then scope 3 emissions on the bottom. There's a similar pattern. There's fewer companies that have high profits per ton, but here we could see that only about the companies that represent around 2% of emissions in this data set have 65% of profits. So it's even more extreme. And the ones that have the highest profits per ton, over $1,000 per ton in all scopes, are companies in insurance, IT, finance, banking, software to some extent. The middle here is more pharma, media companies. And then the high emitters are mining, utility companies, energy companies, automakers that also have giant scope 3 emissions because of the use of their cars, and other very material companies. But if you just take a step back, it's interesting to see some companies are having profits per ton that is over $100,000 per ton. And that also shows that they could pay quite a high price per ton that they emit, and could be expected to really have a credible internal carbon price, or buying high quality carbon credits. And even though these companies that we looked at here have relatively low emission, what we can see is that the potential for impact or the potential for generating actually meaningful amounts of money is immense. So we just looking at our small data set is the biggest companies in the world, but it's only 180 companies that we looked at, and 141 of them were high profit companies that had profits over $1,000 per ton they emit. And if they were to spend $100 per ton for their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and for their scope 3 emissions, for those that had profits over $1,000 per scope 3 as well, that could generate over $27 billion yearly for climate. And that's 2 to 3 times more than the total spend of global climate philanthropy, and 13 times larger than the voluntary carbon market. So it is really a substantial amount of money that could go a very long way. But at the same time, we can note that it is less than 1% of the investments needed for the green transition, as has been estimated by several different sources. And we should see it stuck here. We should also take note that when comparing companies and comparing what type of spend they're having, what kind of ambition levels they're having, you can't just look at one factor, such as the price per ton that they are putting into external climate projects. We should also be looking at their climate contributions from different angles. So, for example, what is as a percentage of revenue, percentage of profit, or as a percentage of dollars per ton emitted internal carbon price. And what looks ambitious from one angle might look different for another one. So here's another graph from the report that we use publicly available data. Some of these companies might have contributed to climate projects that we don't know about. But we looked at publicly available climate spend data on some large companies, and also looked at their profits and the revenue, and calculated how much of the revenue, how much of their profits did they spend, and did they have a dollar per ton amount. And here you can see that typically large companies, some of the biggest buyers of carbon credits, are spending quite a small share of the revenue, like 0.002%, less than 0.2 for many. The ones that are highest are well under 1%, with Delta Airlines had a bad year in 2020. They're still the leader, one of the biggest carbon credit buyers, and 0.1% of revenue for some of the highest spenders. And looking at share of profits, it's also quite low. Many are spending well below 0.1% of profits, with the highest spenders being around 0.1, 0.3. And Delta Airlines actually was really standing out in this this example, with spending 50% of profits in 2021. What's not a normal year for them, but it will still be a very high share of profits. And looking at dollars per ton emitted, you can see that Delta Airlines, even though they spent most of all as a share of revenue and profit, they had quite a low dollar per ton price, but it's also because they are a high emitter. And someone like Swiss Re, which has really been leading the field with pushing a high carbon tax on their entire scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, have a really ambitious internal carbon fee, but as a share of revenue and profit, it's not the same, of course. So it wouldn't be fair to compare just on the dollar per ton emitted, for example. We need to shine a light on corporates' abilities to finance climate from different angles. And then in the report, we have a few recommendations. These are the top ones. And the first one is that companies that they should prioritize to reduce their own emissions through investments in their value chain or in their own operations. But as I alluded to a little bit, this is very likely systematically different between different group of companies. So the group of companies that has the highest profits per ton, if we go back and look at the graph here, the ones that have over $10,000 per ton, they're quite likely to have lower abilities to actually use that money to lower their own emissions, because they're very non-material companies. They might not own a factory. They might not have a fleet of cars, might not have very large investment needs. whereas the ones in the bottom probably have huge investment needs and might not be able to spend much at all on external climate action, and should perhaps then prioritize that and spend most of the money on reducing their emissions. And then on a sliding scale between maybe then spending most externally to most internally. And then the companies that do have a high profit per ton emitted, our suggestion is that they implement an ambitious internal carbon fee. It could be that it covers the future cost of removing the carbon as a minimum, but it could also be choosing the social cost of carbon, for example, which is around $200 per ton in the US estimations, and the UK and Germany as well. And then use that money to support external climate projects. So it's not a shadow tax we're talking about here. Many companies have implemented carbon prices internally to be able to estimate the risks and as a way of highlighting their emissions. But what we're talking about here is an internal carbon fee that actually is generating money to support external projects. And then the level would also differ between sectors, both depending on how much money do they need to spend internally, but also what is their ability to pay, how high is their profits per ton. And another important part is really to disclose the company's total spend, both on internal and external climate projects, so that there can be scrutiny, so that the leaders also can be recognized. We want to have really a race to the top and raise ambitions. As we could see in the graph of how much is spent by revenue and profit, we really have a lot of headroom to grow the corporate financing substantially. And a way to do that is also companies being transparent. So the ones that are spending very little, it's seen that their competitors are spending a lot more, and that can be then an incentivation to start and finance climate projects at larger scales. And also that even though some companies should finance mostly internal projects, we need to start supporting carbon removal and some other climate action right now, because they're so lowly underdeveloped, and we can't afford to wait. There need to be some money put into that. So even these companies can contribute some amount to carbon removal, so these solutions are available at scale later on. And then governments, they should see that the private sector is not going to be able to completely offset their emissions. It is not going to be enough. The companies that have the highest emissions have the lowest profits. It's not going to be realistic to think that the corporate sector is going to carry it. So they also need to continue to see government as probably the biggest actor for carbon removal, as the biggest financer, but also helping out by creating incentives for companies, making it easier, but planning for governments to be able to have to play the largest role in this. And a final note on targets as well. Any company that has a net zero target is implicitly planning to use carbon removal. But as what we're seeing now with the low supply, it's not really feasible that more than a tiny fraction of that could be used to reach net zero with permanent carbon removal today. So another point that we make in the report also is that instead of just focusing on buying X amounts of credit today to make a net zero claim, a more feasible way of supporting the carbon removal ecosystem is trying to help accelerate new solutions for tomorrow. And that could be then buying fewer tons, but they're in new solutions, prototypes of new carbon removal solutions, or incentivizing and spending money on R&D or other things like that. So that's I only had 15 minutes, so it was a quick run through of the report. It's full of other thoughts and recommendations as well, but I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert. And I'll take over now from the CCC side.
Great.
I'm just going to get my slides up. Great to meet you all. My name's Bea Natzler, and I work at the UK Committee on Climate Change. So we are an independent statutory advisor to the UK government on how they should meet their emissions reduction targets. And I'm just going to give a really quick 5-minute presentation on a report we published in October, looking at the role of voluntary carbon offsets in reaching the UK net zero. So I'm just going to go through who we are at the UK Climate Change Committee, what the work is that we've done on voluntary carbon offsets, and a few of the top level findings that came out from that work. So first of all, who are the UK Climate Change Committee? So as I mentioned, we're an independent statutory body, and essentially we put formal advice to the government on steps they should take to make sure they meet the emissions reductions targets that have been put into law in the UK. So to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and to reduce emissions by 78% by 2035. And traditionally at the CCC, we focused our analysis on how to decarbonise specific sectors of the economy. So I've got colleagues who focus their analysis on, say, transport, buildings, manufacturing and construction. But in recent years, we've expanded to also recognise the really key role that private sector actors can play in driving forward the net zero transition. So part of my role involves doing analysis around what government levers are needed to help allow and enable the private sector to really move the net zero transition forward. And it was within that context that I led a report looking at the role of voluntary carbon offsets. So what did the report on voluntary carbon offsets look like, and how did we go about building the evidence base for it? So we launched a call for evidence in early 2022. We got over 50 responses from different stakeholders sharing evidence on the risks and the opportunities that voluntary carbon offsets pose to net zero. We did an internal literature review of over 200 pieces of research and reports relating to this. We had a small project that we commissioned to scrape data looking at the use of offsets in the UK from both the supply and the demand side. And we held some workshops and engagement events with businesses to sense test our findings. So this culminated in a report in October, which set out the evidence base on the risks and opportunities of offsets, and set out recommendations for what government should do to harness the opportunities and avoid the risks. And I just got that bullet point in bold at the bottom right there, which is just to say as well, although our mandate is to advise government, we do have a small section of the report at the end that sets out an example of the kind of advice we think government should be giving businesses on what actions they should be taking before they consider using offsets. So I just mentioned that because that could be a useful resource for those on this call if they are businesses. So what were some of the key findings from our report and research? So as I mentioned, we approached it with a lens of the risks and opportunities of offsets. So you can see on this slide, we tested the evidence against 5 commonly cited risks and 4 commonly cited opportunities, and found mixed evidence for all of these, but in general, there was either medium or strong evidence to support them. So some particular ones to pick out, I won't go through all of them, are the risk that the use of emissions slows down direct emissions reduction because it's used instead of or potentially as a distraction from direct emissions reduction. There was also a pretty strong evidence base for the low quality of some currently traded carbon credits. But on the flip side, there was some good evidence to show that in theory and sometimes in practice, credits could really support some global funding gaps in the next 10 years for nature-based solutions, and in the longer term for permanent or very long-lived removals. So I'm just going to focus in on 2 of these today, given time constraints. So I'm going to focus in on what we found in particular around issue number 1 and issues sort of number 2 and 3 together. So around slowing corporate emissions reduction and quality, and some implications we pulled out of policy. But just before I dive into that, the kind of overarching message and takeaways from our report were that while voluntary carbon offsets have an important but small role to play in the net zero transition, the priority right now is for government to really improve the integrity of this space, because if not, there's a real risk that offsets will be over-relied on, and that the quality of carbon credits will remain low, which could in aggregate actually slow progress to net zero rather than speed it up. However, once hopefully that is put in place by government, we think that there's an important role, small but important role, that voluntary carbon offsets could play with helping to fill global funding gaps, and that this will be significant if demand increases and prices increase. So that's what that graph on the right there shows. It's slightly clunky, so apologies, but essentially if we take published estimates for global offsets demand, only if we take the really top level estimates of demand, which we aren't sure are credible, and assume that prices increase very significantly, would they go a kind of significant way in filling some of the key global funding gaps that we see today. So essentially the message is, first of all, need to sort of tidy up and regulate the space. Then it can have a role, but it won't be too big. So let's not overemphasize it. So just zooming in on those 2 risks. So that first one is around, sort of businesses' reliance on voluntary carbon offsets. So in terms of what we would like to be seeing, it would be great to be seeing rapid decarbonisation from businesses themselves, for themselves and their supply chains, transparency about how businesses are using carbon offsets, and the use of the term net zero only being used once a business has reduced almost all of its emissions and then has purchased long-lived removals for the rest. What we're seeing in general in practice at the moment is that there's limited transparency in organisational net zero claims and how they're using offsets. We're seeing really low prices of carbon credits, which creates the likelihood that businesses will look to use that over emissions reduction, which would probably cost more. And we're seeing a reliance on carbon credit projects with mixed quality, and that businesses are looking to claim net zero when they're sort of on their climate journey, but not at that end point. So what did we recommend to government based on this? So we think government needs to give better guidance to businesses on what appropriate voluntary carbon offset usage looks like. And as I mentioned earlier, we put out an illustration of what this could look like. I've got a bit of an example of it on the next slide. We also recommended that government establish a statutory definition of a net zero business so that it's clearly understood by everyone when they can claim to be net zero, and when, if they're on the pathway to net zero, so reducing emissions in line with what's needed, but not yet reduced all of them, and purchasing carbon credits alongside that, they can get some kind of other claim like offset zero or untracked net zero to still get reputational benefit. And that government should require transparency of organisational reliance on offsets to make net emission claims. So the UK government's due to require large listed UK companies to publish net zero transition plans. So we recommended that within these, businesses should be required to set out their reliance, if at all, on carbon credits, what activity this is being used to offset, where the credits are being sourced from. And it looks likely that this will be included in the net zero transition plan standard. And then what would we like to see from organisations and businesses? Essentially following the guidance the government puts out, being transparent, even if you don't fall within that net zero transition plan standard catchment, and treating offsets as a last resort, but only once the really necessary direct emissions reduction has taken place. So this is, I don't expect you to read this, I'm aware the text is small, apologies, but it's just an example. Essentially, we set out in our report at the end a set of tables, one focused on businesses who are sort of mainstream businesses, one focused, and then various ones focused on businesses in specific sectors such as manufacturing or aviation, just setting out for different decades what key actions to reduce emissions we would expect businesses to do before they look to then offset remaining emissions. So hopefully that's useful as an example. And then finally, just to set out our assessment on that other risk I mentioned, so the quality of existing carbon credits. So what it would be great to see is voluntary carbon offset projects that are actually accurately reporting the emission savings or removals that result from the project, that are resilient to the effects of climate change, and that are fully additional long-term and consider wider impacts on communities, biodiversity, etc. Currently, what we're seeing is really quite a mixed bag. A lot of evidence shows quite limited additionality, so sort of value add of offset projects. There is indications that some offset projects are actively damaging to biodiversity in local communities, although some can be very positive as well. And there's some limitations in existing standards for monitoring these things. So we said to government we'd like to see strengthened standards for voluntary carbon offsets, improved monitoring and verification, and more transparency in the registries for offsets as well. Great, apologies, that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I'm very happy to circulate the report link after the event, and happy to be contacted about it as well. Back to you, Eli.
Thank you, Bea, and thank you, Robert. So I think just to briefly sum up, and panelists, please feel free to start turning your video here. Really excellent to see the results from the report. As Robert said, it's been a long time coming. He and I have been talking about this for almost a year now, and so we're really pleased to have it out in the wild. Also a little nervous because now we're going to have four real leading critique, react, and discuss the topic. I just also wanted to thank and highlight Bea's contribution as not a government entity, but a specific committee that advises the UK government, because of course, I think one of the implications of our analysis, which maybe doesn't come through so clearly, is that this cannot happen without policy change, right? We need to make the cost of emitting much, much higher. So there is that wiggle room to, if necessary, pay for either decarbonization or those high durability removals, one or the other. Something's got to give. So we'll get into that now. But without further ado, I want to introduce our excellent panel. So first we have Salah Saeed. He's the head of sustainability at Klarna, which is one of the leading technology companies that has actually taken a stand and contributed significantly towards high durability carbon removal, but also other forms of climate action. We're also, excuse me, pleased to have Zeke Hausfather. He's the climate research lead at Stripe, which of course is deeply associated and affiliated with Frontier, the largest buyer of carbon removal in the world, $925 million of commitments ready to go into high durability carbon removal projects. So very, very honored to have Zeke here. Scarlett Benson is the Beyond Value Chain Mitigation lead at the Science Based Targets Initiative, which, as many of you know, is one of the only sort of multi-stakeholder initiatives that has actually put out a net zero standard. What does one have to do to be considered or to be able to make a legitimate net zero claim? And finally, we're very, very honored to have with us Henry Shue. He's Professor Emeritus of Politics and International Relations at Merton College at the University of Oxford. He's written extensively about the question of from a moral philosophy standpoint, who should be contributing to clean up the mess that we've caused from climate change, under what circumstances, et cetera. So we're really keen to have his perspective in the conversation. So please, excuse me, COP is getting to me. Please send your questions to the Q&A. We'll have time at the end to bring some of those out and have the panelists discuss. I think I want to just start with some targeted questions to dive right in, and then please feel free to also take the floor and introduce yourself a bit more and what you're doing. And then we'll get into some reactions to the content. So I wanted to start with you, Zeke. Stripe Climate and now Frontier has assembled $925 million of commitments to actually accelerate carbon removal. And, a lot of the companies that have contributed fit into that category that Robert described of the kind of high profits, low emissions. So I think what would it look like for those companies to be even more ambitious? And moreover, how would we harness commitments from other companies that don't necessarily have that, let's say, cash to burn? How do you think about that? And feel free also just to react to the report in general.
Yeah, it's a great question, and you guys have really done a great job exploring these thorny issues in your report. So I can provide a little bit of a U.S. perspective here, and from a company that is in the small emission, large profits category that you identified. What we've seen, particularly in recent years, is a lot of competition around earlier and earlier carbon neutrality commitments by companies, which are often problematically conflated with net zero as a way of climate signaling. With many companies, particularly in the technology sector, now committing to carbon neutrality by 2030, which is not too far from where we are today. However, I personally worry that in practice, this creates a fair amount of perverse incentives to maximize tons on paper at the expense of real impact on the climate. Companies often make real cuts to their facility scope 1 emissions. They buy RECs to cover their scope 2 emissions, which is problematic for many reasons and a whole separate discussion that probably not going to have today. And then they write a check for a couple $1 million to buy low cost offsets for, say, $7 a ton to cover the rest. And what we need is to move toward a system that maximizes impact rather than tons on paper and prioritizes deeper mitigation. SBTi's concept of beyond value chain mitigation provides a really helpful framework here and enables potential other approaches like dollar for ton or dollar for dollar, where you're contributing based a certain amount of dollars based on your tons as an internal carbon price or a certain percent of your profits, both of which could mobilize a lot more resources than the current sort of ton for ton framework that's embraced by most companies. However, we find that there's still a lot of confusion in the market around what beyond value chain mitigation means. And it's an uphill battle to get folks to embrace alternatives to maximizing near-term tons via offsets. We often run into people who tell us, this permanent carbon removal stuff sounds great, but we've only budgeted $7 a ton for our carbon purchases. And so we can't really afford to spend $300 or $500 a ton to support, newly emerging technologies and to sort of drive down their costs. So, folks right now want to write a check and be done, and we need to figure out ways to move beyond that. We need stronger incentives by governments and also in frameworks like SBTi for companies to set interim neutralization targets using permanent removals as part of their near-term science-based targets, at least for fossil value chain emissions, as well as more clarity that carbon neutrality claims using temporary removals don't count, that's not the same thing as net zero, and that companies shouldn't necessarily get a huge amount of credit if they're buying low cost, low quality offsets just to compensate for their remaining emissions. More broadly, we need a range of impactful initiatives that companies are undertaking beyond maximizing tons on paper. These include things like pursuing 24/7 clean energy alternatives to RECs or to renewable energy credits, investing more in nascent permanent carbon removal technologies, as we're doing with Frontier today, investing in landscape restoration that maximizes ecosystem benefits, even if it doesn't necessarily maximize the carbon benefits of natural climate solutions, funding local adaptation, obviously deeper mitigation by companies, and then prioritizing companies within one supply chain that themselves have made strong commitments around these things. And so sort of trying not just to offset one's Scope 3 emissions, but to actively influence suppliers to reduce them. But yeah, that's a lot of things that companies can do. I think the real key is to move beyond maximizing near-term tons and toward a framework that incentivizes maximizing dollars deployed and maximizing impact on the climate.
Thanks, Zeke. And maybe over to you, Salah. I know that Klarna contributed, I think, $1.7 million this year to climate. And some of that takes the form of support for high durability carbon removal. In other cases, I believe it's to support a kind of broad portfolio of impactful climate actions, some of which you're only making a contribution claim on. In other words, you're not saying that you've compensated for having emitted carbon. You're still on the hook for those emissions. You're just saying you did something positive for the climate. So building on Zeke's points, can you talk about your approach and maybe how, if at all, it relates to the findings that Robert and I shared earlier?
Sure. First of all, thanks a lot for having me. I'm Salah, leading sustainability at Klarna. I've been doing sustainability for a bit more than 8 years. I really love the report. I think it was really time for something like that to come out in order for a lot more companies to have a better understanding on how they can compare each other. And also because it really sets out the differentiation that we need to make in order to understand what are relevant contributions, incredible contributions that companies should be making. And building on Zeke's points, and obviously being also a company that is more in the small emitters space, it's the realization that that you can actually create a meaningful impact, although you are a small emitter, while obviously reducing your carbon emissions in your own in your own operations. There's still an opportunity to have a massive impact by maximizing climate impact through, for instance, supporting new solutions in the carbon removal space. So what we did is more of an alternative to offsets and an alternative to neutrality claims. It's less about us going out there and being about we're carbon neutral. It's super easy to achieve, and it's not much that we need to do like a lot of other companies in order to get there. So we designed an approach where we tax ourselves, follow the BCG WWF blueprint for corporate climate action, and basically generate funds from this internal carbon tax that on the one hand incentivizes internally us to continuously move forward on our decarbonization journey, but then also to generate those funds to projects that are new and innovative and are tackling one of the most pressing challenges with regards to climate change. And we work with Milky Wire, one of our partners that helps us identify solutions in the carbon removal space, but also beyond that, like advocacy organizations that that support the transition towards carbon removal and tries to put also policymakers and hold policymakers more accountable in that space. And those funds, they usually go to a variety of different solutions that really have a funding gap and that wouldn't be possible without the contributions we would be making. And it's less about us really counting the credits that we would be getting for the removals that we enable, but rather about helping those solutions to scale up, to be ready for other potential buyers. So what we see in the space is a lot of VC capital, but a lot less money from actual buyers for those credits. And obviously, as a small emitting company, we are in the luxurious position to say we can help those companies scale up in order to be available for the larger market on the long term. So we're also fine to pay artificially high prices for buying credits in the removal space. And that really just sounded logical for us because it really is about not us being able to make a neutrality claim, but rather enabling the world to achieve net zero. And we feel that if we start fostering this journey, we can invite much more partners and other companies to do the same. And maybe just one last comment and thought I had, building on Zeke's comments and Robert's input. I feel like a lot of companies really look at decarbonization or in general climate contributions as a linear process. So I really need to understand my greenhouse gas emissions and how I'm performing. and all of that in order to make a contribution. I think we need to move away from that. I think we need to do this in tandem. Even though I have not all the answers ready for my own greenhouse gas emissions, I may already be able today to make a contribution that actually really counts. Because even as a small emitting company, getting to net zero at some point may have a really, really micro or small impact on the whole world. So it's rather, I think, the advice to already think about meaningful contributions that go beyond the value chain emissions.
I love that point, Salah. Before I switch over to Scarlett, just to say that that's been a discussion that I've heard a lot at COP, that sustainability teams at companies are becoming accounting teams. They're pouring resources into accounting perfectly for scope 1, 2, 3 and emissions and all this stuff, and sort of spinning cycles trying to quantify the problem, which is important. But if we know directionally that certain activities are getting us closer to net zero with not much time to remain, don't let that stop you, essentially. So Scarlett, we talked about beyond value chain mitigation, so it'd be great for you to kind of make clear what that is. I did want to raise one point, which is that, Science Based Targets Initiative has done such an amazing job of putting emission elimination first and foremost, this idea that you must eliminate your emissions by 90%. At the same time, that poses a quandary for some of the higher durability carbon removal methods that we at carbongap and everyone I think on this call knows are going to be necessary for the journey to net zero, net negative and beyond to get us back to the atmosphere of today, hopefully back even to 2015, maybe even 1850. Can't do that without those. So I wondered if you could speak to that tension between the guidance that SBTi is putting out and the reality that we actually need contributions from organizations like Klarna, Stripe, and many others, even in advance of having made that 90% emission reduction journey. It actually builds, I think, on Salah's point of the non-linearity of these activities.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Scarlett, Benson, and I'm leading the Beyond Value Chain mitigation work at SBTi. So I don't know whether all of you, but you may have seen the net zero standard, which was published ahead of COP last year. And there are 4 elements to it. So you have the reduction of emissions in the kind of near term, in the long term, up to 2050. You have this bucket called beyond value chain mitigation, which I'll talk about. And then you have the neutralization of the residual emissions that's left over. Those pathways to work out how much each sector has to reduce by are defined by essentially kind of the concept of ability to pay and ability to even decarbonize. So looking at the ability of certain technologies to come down in costs over time. So those pathways are essentially, challenging for sure, but in theory, they are feasible for these companies to deliver on. And there's going to be these emissions left over, which we know are kind of infeasible or too costly to abate. And so, you mentioned the quandary there between, the reductions today and the removals that we need in the future. I mean, let's be clear, if we don't achieve those reductions today, we need more removals in the future. So it's, this is never a question of and or, it's totally both. The less you reduce your emissions today, the more we're going to have to spend on removals in the future. The challenge here is that we're often kind of fighting the different communities, maybe that's the wrong word, but we're kind of pulling the same pieces of the finance pie. So we're saying, oh no, let's spend that money on removals instead of reductions. And the real point is that we need to increase the size of the pie. We need more climate finance in the system, much, much, much more. So, I think it's really the SBTi within its beyond value chain mitigation work is not necessarily leaning towards kind of emissions reductions or removals. We're saying that both are needed over the next transition. So maybe just to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing, and I'll talk about it around the 5 W's. So we're going to be developing a series, a guidance document that will be published next year on what the different approaches of beyond value chain mitigation look like, and what are the kind of integrity guardrails, what transparency requirements need to be kind of tied to those, and recommendations for essentially how we create these incentives. So the report that you guys have produced is really hugely valuable, and a lot of the sort of research questions that we have are, answered by the report. So thank you for your contribution. And as I say, I'm just a month into the job, so it's a daunting task ahead of me, and I'm really glad to be in sort of a community of people thinking through these really thorny issues, because there's no clear answer here. So the 5 whys, what we're looking at is what counts. So what counts as beyond value chain mitigation? Do you have to tie it to a ton? Is it removals? Is it reductions? Could it be investment in climate advocacy? Could it even be investment in adaptation? What are the, what do we think are the investments that count as beyond value chain mitigation if a company was to be able to make some sort of claim or statement that they were doing this activity? So what counts? Where? So where is the finance gap? And where is there kind of a need for more finance to be flowing from the private sector? And linked to that, when? So which emissions reductions and removals need to happen at what point in time? So there are certain things that are very urgent for us to channel finance to. In the near term, we have quite terrifying evidence of tipping points in certain natural ecosystems where these ecosystems could release huge volumes of carbon into the atmosphere and, mean that a lot of this is really kind of game over. So we need to be investing today very heavily to ensure the kind of protection of those existing carbon sinks. And then, when as well, as you say, is if we're going to have all of these removals that we need at the end, when do we have to make those investments? Because the cost today is very high and we need to start to bring the costs of those down. So when is very, very important. Who is the next one? So how do we allocate responsibility to different actors? And I'm really excited about Henry's presentation to hear a bit more about this. I think, looking at the abatement costs of different sectors, so how much are they actually going to have to invest to decarbonize their own value chains, and should they be focusing on that? How much profit are they making? How much historic impact have they had? All of these sorts of questions we're looking at. And I think maybe just one side note on the allocation. Often when we talk about the kind of high profit, low emission companies like the tech sector, those companies actually also do have a very significant driver of global emissions through their advertising, driving consumerism, etc. So just because they have a small kind of scope 1, 2, and 3 footprint doesn't mean they're not huge drivers of emissions today. So allocation is very important, and the challenge with allocation is, with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, it's not necessarily always something that can be defined based on science. It's sometimes an ethical judgment. So and then the final one, which is my favorite, is why. So why would corporates do this? What are the incentives that we can create in order to get them to do this? Now, a claim is one that people often talk about. So if you have a claim that they can say, we've got our science-based target and we're doing this beyond value chain mitigation on top, and they can make some claim. A claim matters because you can, in theory, sell more of your product to consumers or attract more capital from investors. But it's certainly, in my view, not the only incentive, and it's not going to be sufficient. And this is why things like policy are so important. So, whilst SBTi's focus is very much on, developing corporate standards, we are also trying to think more outside the box, and very keen to work with others to think about these broader sets of incentives. Could governments that have made commitments to channel finance into lower income countries, could they give some sort of tax incentive perhaps, where they're able to encourage companies to make these beyond value chain mitigation investments, and they could in some way claim some portion of that climate finance through the tax incentive. I'm not proposing there anything to get messed up in Article 6, but just putting some sort of kind of innovative ideas about how we start to get this finance flowing very fast. Now, maybe just one last thing to mention on the why. People ask me this question all the time, and I do sometimes struggle with trying to think about what the incentives are, because we know for some of these sectors, the cost is going to be very large. And for these sectors to be giving significant portions of their profit away, there needs to be a strong case for them to do it. So it's very important. But I also think we need to remember that the Science-Based Targets Initiative is a voluntary standard. And we have 4,000 companies that are on the journey of setting targets, with over 2,000 of those companies, or almost 2,000, sorry, of those companies in the process of implementing those targets with the targets validated. They represent more than a third of the world's market capital and a huge portion of the world's emissions. This is all voluntary. Companies have chosen to do this already. They didn't do it. They did it in the absence of regulation because they recognize that climate change is bad for business. And so I think we really need to underscore, yes, a claim is an important incentive, but there is a real, there is a business case for businesses to make these investments. And we just really need to highlight that and perhaps highlight how it's different for different sectors and how, even within a company, how somebody in marketing or the procurement team might benefit in different ways. So a long journey ahead of us in terms of working this all out, and I'm very grateful to discuss this here with you today.
Thank you, Scarlett. And I love that point about the science base in the name makes it difficult. Maybe it would make sense to make clear where something is in fact based on some evidence base and where some normative element is required. And that having that distinction in the guidance would actually be really powerful and help make distinct where it's coming from. I also think you touched on something that I'd love to get Professor Shue's reaction on and other interventions he'd like to make on this topic around this allocation question about, we have had this polluter pays paradigm where whatever emissions you're responsible for, you have to clean up. But who is you? Because companies can have impacts far beyond the emissions they specifically create. And also, if it's just fundamentally impossible to rally the resources needed to get to net zero holistically from the companies that have the money to do so, you start to have to look to these alternative paradigms. So it's a really tricky question. So over to you, Professor Shue, on that or other reactions you wanted to offer.
Well, you're right, it's tricky, and Scarlett is right that these are ethical issues. The polluter pays principle is one, and ability to pay is another. So you have these two different principles that are ethical principles. Polluter pays is really absolute minimum. I mean, what it says is if you've made a mess, clean it up. All that amounts to is don't leave the world worse than it would have been if you hadn't been here. That's utterly minimal, I think. And ability to pay is a principle for people who'd like to do a bit more than just not leave the world worse than they found it, who would like to do something positive. And one way to emphasize the importance of the ability to pay is it's an alternative to a flat rate. People sometimes, because ability to pay, like progressive income tax is a good example, usually means if you have greater resources, you not only contribute more, but you contribute at a higher rate. Now, that's not what everybody means, but that's, I think, the best way to interpret it. And the alternative to that is contribute at a flat rate. That might seem fairer. You say, well, what could be fairer than everybody making the same contribution, same rate? But that ignores where people are afterwards. Afterwards, if you have a flat rate, the people who started out worst off are considerably more burdened than the people who started out best off. The idea of ability to pay is you can make an even greater contribution than other people, and you still will end up even better off than they are, and you will have done much more to deal with the problem. I can see we're very short on time. I think, let me stop there and
well, I think we're going to, thank you. I want to ask you one more thing, actually. And I think we are going to, okay with everyone, we're going to go a little bit over because we have so many great questions coming in the chat. We're going to keep the conversation going on LinkedIn afterward as well. But I think one thing we're kind of dancing around is this whole voluntary piece, the idea that companies volunteer to do good things. And I think, I feel, and I think one of our positions at Carbon Gap is that we've maybe lulled ourselves, the world has, and at COP, I can see this, a bit of false sense of security that we can trust or count on companies to volunteer to do these things when they actually, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you feel, they are legally obligated to maximize their profits. And to Scarlett's point, they are contributing to climate because there's some ulterior motive, whether noble or ignoble, it doesn't matter. There's a reason why they're doing that. And we're grateful that they are. But I'd love, excuse me, I'd love, Professor Shue, if you could touch on this question about the question of whether to leave this up to voluntary action or when this needs to be mandatory, either incentivized and encouraged or made means of compliance. And, you know, where's the point in time where we need to make these principles that you're describing, the idea of you made a mess, clean it up, mandatory and enshrined in the economic logic of our society, rather than being left up to, you know, fingers crossed, we hope Frontier doubles in size, and we do. So maybe if you could touch on that question, and if others want to react, I know it's a maybe slightly controversial point.
Well, things can be fairer if a requirement is imposed by the government on everyone. So I think it is true that the ideal would be to have government requirements of various sorts, but we don't have them, and many governments are essentially politically captured by the fossil fuel interests, I would say. I mean, there's no way to talk about this without being a bit political, but I mean, I think, you know, the fact that every government in the G20 still subsidizes production of fossil fuels, for example, sort of suggests that fossil fuel interests have a bit more influence on government decisions than they should. So, although ideally we'd have governments that would think this through and then impose the ideal requirements on corporations, we certainly can't wait for that. And we need for corporations who are willing to and who care about future generations and the environment to take action on their own. They may end up doing more than other people do. That's, in a way, too bad. But if the other people aren't doing what they ought to do, then you will indeed do more than they're doing. But you're also making the world a much better place and protecting future generations.
Thank you. Other reactions or thoughts on that?
Yeah,
or should we?
If I may add to that, I think it's also a lot about what you can do, right? Obviously, for a lot more companies, it's so hard to tackle value chain emissions and, you know, start the decarbonization journey. But I feel like whenever we talk about more regulation and more standardization in that space, which is obviously needed, I do think that it takes away a little bit the innovation degree that you can see, and it takes away the maybe new opportunities that companies can deliver when tackling climate change. So one thing, when we ask ourselves about what is it that we can do beyond just decarbonizing and then making those voluntary contributions, is about how can we use our reach and our network and our platform, basically our superpowers, to invite others to join this journey. So if we reach 150 million consumers every day, is there a way for us to invite consumers to join us in supporting these new technologies in the removal space? And we've been trying this out for a while, and I feel like if this would be regulated, it would be just so much harder to think about innovative ways to invite more companies, more people that are part of the value chain to contribute to new solutions. So I kind of feel like we need to think a bit more creatively about those new actions that companies can take.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I also think we should be clear that in the long run, it is going to be government procurement, government compliance markets that's driving the vast majority of investment in all of these technologies and in deep mitigation. And, you know, we can play a very important role right now in setting the stage for that world, in, you know, taking bets that are riskier than governments might be willing to take to drive technological development and learnings. But we also need to be prepared for a world where there are more compliance markets, where everything is, you know, more standardized and connected. I think there's also is going to be a role for governments to play in driving companies to make bigger commitments in the long run. Like right now, it's really tough to convince a company to go from $10 a ton to $50 a ton to $100 a ton to $200 a ton in terms of the amount they're willing to commit to climate spending, and having, you know, outside incentives, either through stronger reporting standards, through government incentives or government programs or compliance markets is going to be an important driver of increasing spend on this.
So, but we're going to have to get the governments to do all these things, which means political action and means retiring some current politicians and electing some who care more about the climate.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to add, I think it's sometimes also useful to think about the kind of risk return profile of different types of investors, public and private. So, investment in removals is actually often an investment that has a return. And so it makes sense for the private sector to pay for a lot of that investment. Whereas there are other types of investment which need, significantly de-risking, potentially investment into nature, where, at the moment we don't currently value nature, and you might not get the same returns. So I think also having an understanding of how, of where is finance, where do you need to, how do you leverage public finance in the way that's going to be most effective, because it's the only bit that can pay, essentially.
Yeah, we are going to go a little bit over just because this is so fascinating. So we're going to go another 9 minutes. I'm going to just throw one question into the air, but ask that we don't answer it. And then we're going to go to audience questions. And that is, if we think about how much money companies have to voluntarily contribute to anything, to Henry's point, what if instead they contributed that money to advocacy efforts to change the rules of the game so that there is a patchwork of policy that provides the incentives and the compliance to make this the law of the land? That's an option. So you could reduce emissions, you could buy removals, or you could put that same money towards changing the conditions for everyone so that there's really no choice in the matter. Or rather, to put it more softly, it's the logical thing to do because the incentives are in place. So that's a vast abuse of the moderator privilege to put a question out there that we should talk about on LinkedIn afterwards. Over to audience questions. There have been some amazing questions coming in. I wanted to do a rapid fire one. Matt Curley asks, what sectors or types of emissions should CDR be allowed to compensate for? Somebody want to give a quick popcorn response to that?
So I think if we're ensuring high quality CDR and permanent removals, the cost is going to be so high, it's only going to make sense to spend on things where it's, well over $100 a ton. And that limits it to certain residual emissions, or in the context of private sector companies, emissions just that remain outside that company's direct control and ability to reduce.
I think what you're saying is you're linking the type of removal with the emission. It's not a removal to any emission. You're saying specific emissions that are at a very high cost to eliminate. Those are the ones you'd match with the removals for compensation. Is that correct?
Yeah, that either a high cost or an inability of the company to directly reduce it, because otherwise it's almost always going to be cheaper just to reduce emissions than pay multiple $100s a ton for high quality permanent removals.
Okay, thank you. Marian Kruger asks, how should companies with these high profits per ton of CO2 and relatively low emissions, how should those corporates approach carbon removal investment in practice? In other words, they have options. They can go to Frontier or NextGen. They can use a platform like Milky Wire. They could develop the internal capacity themselves, like Microsoft has done, to be their own police of what is good and bad removal. Or they could work with consultancies. There's groups like Carbon Direct and others. So any ideas on what recommendations to give to some of the companies that are either in the room right now or will watch this recording later? How should they engage with high durability carbon removal purchases?
Happy to dive in, I guess. So for that, I think that right now, the easiest approach is probably joining existing buyers groups like Frontier. I think in the longer run, we need stronger standard setting bodies for the field so we can have the ability of buyers to purchase high quality tons without having to do a huge amount of vetting and scientific analysis themselves or hire high price consultants. And I think part of that is just a story of maturing the space and getting more clarity around what is sort of verified, qualified tons using standardized and approved protocols and methodologies.
Yeah, maybe just adding on that, and I agree with you, Zeke. I think there is the opportunity of tapping into what is already out there, or being a bit bolder and really supporting those technologies that aren't up to speed yet. Because I think that's the investment that really matters, especially for the future, is enabling the early stage solutions to actually go outside the R&D phase and actually bring certain results to place.
Thanks. Really interesting question from Tim Kruger. Given the long-lived nature of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, essentially infinite or very long-lived nature, should we be considering cumulative historical emissions from a given entity rather than just current ongoing emissions?
Yes, I think so. I think the best measure of responsibility, if you're talking about polluter pays and cleaning up your own mess, is cumulative emissions. It gets quite complicated because, of course, many of the emissions were done by people who are now dead, our fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers. And it's a little complicated how to deal with that. But I mean, I think the basic idea is that the society that is ongoing. And so I didn't produce all those emissions, but my great-grandfather and grandfather did. And by those emissions, they created a wealthier, healthier, happier society that I live in. And so I think it's reasonable that I bear responsibility because I'm also benefiting from what they did. But that's a bit of a long story.
Thank you, Henry. Any other thoughts on that? I did see, I think Petya Trendafilova mentioned something similar. In an ideal world, it should be mandatory for corporations to pay for historic emissions along with future emissions at a flat rate. That's an interesting point, paying for future emissions at a flat rate. Any reactions to that point?
Well, I would say progressive ability to pay interpreted in a progressive way is actually better than flat rate because the people who have the excess capacity can do more and they'll still be better off than the other people who started out worse off.
I also think it really depends on what are you paying for and what's the impact you're generating with this payment, right? Like if there is a genuine or a positive impact connected to that, historical footprint, obviously it's nothing bad. But I mean, we've seen examples from leading companies that have done that and then transitioned from doing that. Again, because they realized maybe it wasn't the right and the most ambitious approach in doing that, maybe because they chose to buy cheaper credits or so. And I think it's really more about what are you actually going to do about the historical emissions?
Yeah, thanks. We're going to have to close now, unfortunately. There was a great question. There are lots of great questions. We saw one from Jamie Stephen looking at this, basically the implications of this analysis for countries and the fact that different countries have different resource and industry dependent conditions. I think that would be a fascinating conversation to continue on LinkedIn and maybe in a future report. I just wanted to thank the Carbon Gap team, Devina, Kayla, Sim, Sophia, and others for helping prepare this report, this launch event, everything. My co-author, Robert, who presented the analysis earlier, so pleased to have worked with you, Robert, on this project. And our excellent panelists, thank you so much for joining us. So I think just to close, we want to leave this as a kind of topic to discuss and think about, because at the end of the day, you can look at how much companies are contributing to climate change. And again, not just companies. We could apply the same thinking to individuals. We could apply this thinking to countries, member states of the EU, what have you. And I think the reality is at any given time, we can observe how an entity is contributing to the fight on climate change in multiple lenses. We can look at it, as Robert showed us, through a percentage of revenue, a percentage of profit, or this dollars per ton of CO2 language that we're also invoking. And that allows us to actually show the kind of, well, here we are at COP, I guess, common but differentiated responsibilities of different economic actors to actually come together and solve this problem. And I think, high durability removals specifically are such a critical subset of climate solution that need support now. So it's great to see that things like Frontier, the contributions from Milky Way and others, and hopefully some of the updated guidance from SBTi going forward will help leave open room so that people can make those contributions, get that industry moving at the same time that we eliminate emissions. So thank you everybody for joining us. I'm Eli Mitchell-Larson from Carbon Gap, Robert Höglund from Marginal Carbon. Please continue the discussion, and thanks so much for joining.